Frank Wren had killed before. Men, women, rebels, soldiers, once even a child by mistake. He used to count back when he thought the number meant something. Before Tyrion's gate, that was the last time he'd tried to save someone, and failed. The girl in the bunker hadn't screamed, just stared at him with wide golden eyes as the ceiling caved in and the firestorm took her. He'd made it out. She hadn't. He remembered the color of her skin, the shape of her face, and for some reason, all these years later, he remembered the soundless way she died. Frank stepped off the shuttle and into the poisonous air of Velhara 9, wondering if this godforsaken rock would be where he finally balanced the scales. Velhara 9 was a forgotten place, a planet that never made it onto Union maps because the people who lived here paid well to stay invisible. The atmosphere stank of damp minerals and slow decay. Bioluminescent moss pulsed faintly along every ridge of stone, casting everything in sickly blues and greens. The wind here didn't blow, it whispered. Frank tugged his coat tighter and walked toward the mouth of a black stone tunnel. Kulakan. The word meant root in some dead dialect, but here it referred to the deep underground flesh market where money and morality came to die. Built into the caverns left by ancient mining colonies, Kulakan was less a marketplace and more a mausoleum of ethics. Silent, echoing, foul. Everything here was luxury. Everything here was rot. He passed empty-eyed servants bred for aesthetic, bodies carved into walking art, genetic trophies preserved in display pods. In one stall, a child-shaped android designed to mimic fear reactions flinched automatically whenever someone looked at it. In another, a mutated singer whose vocal cords had been modified to cry in 4 octaves of pain. Frank ignored it all. He wasn't here to buy. He was here for Kano Vreth, the man who had betrayed their unit during the purge on Tyrion's gate. The man who had walked away while dozens of civilians burned and left Frank to carry the weight. Now, Cain dealt in flesh and made his credit selling slaves to the rich and rotten. Frank planned to put a bullet in him. That was the mission. But then, he saw her. The chamber was dim, lit only by strips of cold neon that flickered with age. Glass walls encased a platform, and on it stood something, or someone, so still he almost thought she was a projection. She was beautiful. Not in a soft way, in the way hurricanes are beautiful. Blue skin, luminous and cold, stretched over an elegant frame that looked too fragile to stand. Her long black hair spilled over her shoulders like dark water, pooling at her hips. And her eyes, deep violet, glowing faintly, were fixed on nothing. Not the room, not the crowd, not him. She wasn't watching, she was waiting. Not for rescue, not for kindness, for pain. Because that was the only thing that ever came. He didn't move. Not right away. The tag beside her listed her as Thalen Stock, empath class. It was rare to see one alive, let alone unsedated. Their race had once been honored, peaceful, telepathic, attuned to the emotional frequencies of all living things. But that gift became their curse. The galaxy didn't want peace anymore. It wanted entertainment. And Thalen's screams were addictive. She had likely been auctioned a dozen times, sold as an emotional amplifier, rigged with internal biolinks that forced her nervous system to respond to others' pleasure or pain. Her body didn't just react, it mirrored. If someone nearby felt rage, her pulse spiked. If someone wanted her afraid, she trembled. For 2 years, she'd lived like that. Now she stood in front of him, untouched only because breaking her too soon would lower her market value. Frank felt something shift in his gut, not pity, something deeper, something older, recognition. Then came the voice. Well, never thought I'd see that face again. Kano Vreth. He stepped from the shadows, looking like power and decay in human skin, still smug, still vile. He gestured toward the girl with a smirk. Piece of work, isn't she? Took months to condition properly. Had to wipe her twice. Emotions that strong don't break easy. Frank didn't answer. Empath class. Pure gene line. Almost a relic, really. Half the buyers want her for aesthetics, the rest for the resonance. He felt his hand drift to his coat, where the hilt of a blade rested under the fabric. It would be so easy, one slice across the throat. But something held him back. How much? Frank asked, voice low. Kano blinked, then laughed. Wait, you're buying her? You? Frank didn't repeat himself. She's not cheap. Custom chain-bonded, synced to Tier 3 control modules, full Neuralink access. You sure you know what to do with one of these, old man? Frank pulled a solid-state crypto stick from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. Encrypted wealth. Blood money. Enough to buy a district, let alone a girl. Kano whistled. You always did know how to make an exit. Frank stepped toward the enclosure. The handlers disengaged the neural lock with a magnetic key, and the collar around the girl's neck blinked once, then deactivated. The moment it shut off, something subtle shifted in her eyes. Not relief, not fear, curiosity. Frank didn't touch her. He just looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know what you've been told," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "But I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't move, didn't speak. But the faintest narrowing of her eyes told him she heard, and that some part of her didn't quite believe it. He turned and walked away. She followed. 3 minutes later, he cornered Cano in a back corridor, shoved him against the wall, and slit his throat without a word. Cano gurgled, wide-eyed, as his blood spilled across the floor tiles. Frank didn't watch him die. Sirai did. She stood in the doorway, silent, watching, not horrified, not shocked, just watching, because she'd seen worse. And maybe, just maybe, she knew what it meant that he hadn't used a gun. On the ship, she sat across from him the entire flight and never said a word. She didn't eat, didn't sleep. She watched the stars pass in silence. Frank wanted to say something. He didn't. What was there to say? He had bought her, freed her, killed for her, but he didn't even know her name. And yet somehow, when their eyes met across the dim light of the cabin, she didn't look at him like an owner. She looked at him like a question. And in her stillness, in the impossible quiet that settled between them, he felt something strange. She wasn't waiting for pain anymore. She was waiting for the truth. The ship touched down with a soft hiss, the sound swallowed by the thick mist clinging to the planet's surface like breath held too long. Frank powered down the controls and sat still for a moment, hands resting lightly on the console. His reflection wavered in the display glass, older than he remembered, eyes darker than they used to be. He looked like a man halfway between death and survival, and not entirely certain which he preferred. Behind him, the girl hadn't moved. She sat exactly where she had during the entire trip from Kulikan, legs tucked beneath her, long black hair spilling over her shoulders like silk ink. Her blue skin shimmered faintly under the cabin lights, but her eyes never met his. She stared out the viewport, silent and motionless, as if waiting for the universe to remember she existed. Frank stood, grabbed his coat from the hook near the hatch, and turned toward her. "We're here," he said. No response. He didn't expect one. The doors hissed open, and cool air, sharp with the scent of moss and metal, slipped inside. He stepped out first, letting the chill slap him awake, then paused and glanced over his shoulder. She was already rising, fluid, quiet, deliberate. She moved with the kind of grace that came not from confidence, but from habitual fear. The elegance of someone who had learned to survive by never being noticed. The mist on Velhara 9 clung to everything. It curled around her ankles as she stepped onto the landing platform, trailing through her hair and across her bare arms like it was trying to touch her before he did. Frank led her up a narrow stone path toward the only structure in sight. The Thorns. That's what the estate was called. Not officially. There was no registry, no title. But locals called it that because of the sharp, vine-like architecture that wrapped around the upper balconies like iron ivy. The house loomed through the haze, tall and crooked, its walls swallowed by climbing flora and half-buried relics of a time when it had once mattered to someone. Now it was just his. He tapped a code into the side panel. The door opened with a low groan. She hesitated at the threshold. Frank didn't say anything. He walked in, boots echoing against polished obsidian tile, and left the door open behind him. She stepped in after a long moment, shoulders drawn tight, eyes scanning the entryway like a prisoner expecting her cell to close behind her. But the door remained open until it timed out and sealed itself automatically. She flinched at the hiss. The foyer was dim, lit only by narrow beams of light filtering through vertical slits in the ceiling. Faint glowing fungi had taken root in the corners, casting soft green and purple hues across the black walls. The air smelled clean, cool. No chemicals, no antiseptic, no blood. Frank walked ahead, not checking if she followed. "Your room's upstairs, second door on the right, bathroom's through there. Water's filtered, food is automated. You're not locked in." Still nothing. He stopped at the foot of the staircase and turned toward her. She was standing just inside the threshold of the room, every muscle tight, her breathing shallow. Her eyes darted from ceiling to floor to him to the nearest shadow. He remembered that look. The same look the girl at Tyrion's gate had worn just before the roof collapsed. Frank softened his voice. "You can rest here. No one's going to touch you. Her eyes met his for the first time since Kulikan, and he saw it then. Deep beneath the distrust, past the trained stillness, under layers of pain and conditioning, something alive was still in there. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. He nodded toward the stairs. Go, sleep, eat, or don't. No one's going to make you do anything. She didn't move. So Frank turned away, let her decide in her own time, and walked down the hall toward the side room he used as his office. He poured himself a glass of synth whiskey and stared out the cracked window at the twisting, mist-soaked forest beyond. Her footsteps on the stairs came 5 minutes later. He exhaled, slow and quiet. Maybe that meant something. Maybe not. Upstairs, Sirae entered the room like someone expecting it to vanish. Her bare feet made no sound on the heated floor. The walls were lined with old books, soft lighting, and faint traces of incense baked into the corners of the ceiling. There was a bed with clean sheets, a folded blanket, a full water pitcher and glass beside it. Nothing else. No restraints. No chains. She stood for a long time without touching anything. Her fingers hovered near the bed frame, then pulled back. She sat on the floor instead, back to the wall, eyes fixed on the door. She didn't sleep, because nothing about the room made sense. Rooms this clean always meant pain. Kindness was always a mask. She knew the pattern. They all followed it. Offer comfort, wait for trust, then destroy. But nothing happened. Hours passed. The lights dimmed automatically with the lunar cycle. Outside, a storm whispered through the trees, brushing mist against the windows in wet streaks. Still, no sound, no voice, no command. Downstairs, Frank watched an old holo report flicker against the wall. He wasn't seeing it. His mind kept circling back to her silence, her eyes, her blue skin, her breathing too even, like she'd trained herself to avoid detection. He poured another drink, didn't touch it. She looked like the girl he hadn't saved, not in body, but in the same way a wound looked like the last one that nearly killed you. Frank had once led men into slaughter, carved peace through fire and silence. And now, somehow, he'd brought home a mirror of everything he'd ever failed. Why? He didn't know, not yet. But he couldn't stop thinking about the way she followed him out of Kulikan without hesitation. Not because she trusted him, because he was the first person who didn't look at her like she belonged to him. Upstairs, Sirae finally moved. She touched the blanket with her fingertips, slowly, gently, like it might vanish. Then she wrapped herself in it, curled in a corner, and fell asleep for the first time in over a year. Not because she was safe, but because, for once, no one had told her what to feel. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to rest. For now. Sirae awoke before dawn, not with a start. There were no alarms here, no screams, no rough voices dragging her out of half-sleep by the hair. Just the quiet rustle of air moving through open vents, and the way shadows shifted on the wall as the morning light began to bleed through the mist. For a long time, she didn't move. She just listened. Silence could be deceptive. In her old life, it had always come before something worse. A punishment, a test, or worse. A moment where they let her believe she was safe, only to remind her that safety was just a trick they could take away. She shifted under the blanket slowly, brushing her fingers along the fabric. Still warm, still soft, still real. The strange bed held no stains, no restraints, no scent of others. The only scent was faint, some kind of lavender dust in the corners of the room, not synthetic, natural. Her body ached, not from pain, but from confusion, from the lack of it. She sat up, long hair sliding forward over her shoulders, pooling in her lap like dark water. The blue hue of her skin, once vibrant in her youth, had dulled over the years, faded under the weight of captivity. Now, in the dim light of early morning, it seemed to almost glow again. Her eyes drifted to the door. Closed. No lock. That alone made her nervous. She stood and padded to it, bare feet soundless on the stone floor. She paused, hand hovering over the panel, waiting for the electric zap, the neural jolt, the collar to seize. None came. The door slid open with a soft whoosh. She stepped into the hallway like an animal trained to expect punishment for curiosity. Each step was deliberate, every sense tuned to the air, the walls, the temperature. There were no eyes on her, no cameras, no invisible pulse of a scan, just light, filtered through panels high in the ceiling, and the smell of something warm, food. She followed it like a thread. The kitchen was brighter than the rest of the house, but not sterile. The walls were a soft gray, half covered in ivy, that had crept in from a cracked panel somewhere near the roof. The scent of steeping tea drifted through the room, not the kind used to sedate, real herbs. She could feel it in the subtle tingle on her tongue as she breathed. He was there. Frank stood at the stove, back to her, shoulders slightly hunched as if he were trying not to take up too much space. He wore a dark shirt rolled at the sleeves and old military pants that looked like they hadn't seen a press in years. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't speak. She watched him pour tea into 2 cups. Only then did he glance back. Their eyes met, and she saw it again. That same look he'd worn the moment he killed her owner. Not satisfaction, not pride, regret, deep and gnawing. "You're up," he said quietly. She didn't answer. He reached for one of the mugs and gestured slightly toward the table. "You can sit if you want." Still, she stayed near the doorway, 1 step inside, no further. Frank sighed, but not in frustration. He set the mug down at the far side of the table. Not close enough to trap her, just within reach. "You're not a prisoner here, Sirai." Her name on his lips caught her off guard. She stiffened, blinked. "You know my name," she said, her voice faint, raw from disuse. "You said it, last night, in your sleep." Her heart kicked once in her chest. She hadn't meant to speak. She hadn't spoken freely in so long she didn't remember doing it. He turned to face her fully now, arms crossed over his chest. He looked different in daylight. Not younger, but less like a monster, just tired. Like someone who'd been surviving so long, he forgot how to live. "I should introduce myself properly," he said after a beat. "Frank Wren." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I know that name." He nodded slowly. "You probably do." "You were at Tyrion's gate." The words hung between them like a dropped blade, cold, sharp. Frank looked away. "Yes," he said simply. "I was." She took one cautious step into the room. "They said you commanded the orbital division, that you gave the order to fire." He didn't flinch, but his throat moved as he swallowed something down. "I did." Sirai's fingers curled at her sides. She didn't know why she'd said it, why she was still standing here. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to strike, to make him feel what her people had felt. But something in his voice, he wasn't lying, and he wasn't excusing. "I tried to override the order when I realized what was happening," Frank added, quieter now. "But I was too late. The firing system had been cued already. I got out. No one else did." Sirai stepped forward again, now 2 steps in. She could feel the weight of his shame. Empathy wasn't just a skill for her kind. It was a burden, a constant storm of noise from others that seeped into your skin. Most Thalen were trained to dull it, but after years of forced emotional exposure, her control had fractured. She didn't just feel his guilt. She felt how long he'd carried it, how heavy it was, how hollow it had made him, and she hated that it made her pause. Frank returned to the table and sat, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve that." Sirai looked at the mug again, then at him, then finally stepped forward and sat at the far end of the table. He didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased. "I didn't bring you here to own you," he said. "I brought you here because I couldn't leave you in that place. Not again." She took the mug between her hands, held it for a while before speaking. "Why me?" Frank was silent for a long time. "You looked at me," he said at last. "Back in Kulakan, you looked at me like you recognized something. And I didn't want to be the kind of man who walked away from that again." She studied him, the way his jaw tensed, how his eyes stayed locked on the wood grain of the table. "You don't even know me," she said. "I'm starting to." A long silence passed between them, the kind that was filled with thought rather than tension. "Can I ask you something?" she said, barely above a whisper. He met her gaze. "If I had been someone else, uglier, older, broken in a different way, would you have still taken me?" Frank's eyes didn't waver. "I don't know," he admitted. That was the first honest thing anyone had ever said to her. She nodded once. "I don't know what I am without being someone's possession," she said softly. "You'll figure it out," he replied, "if you want to." Sirai finished the tea. The heat grounded her. The silence didn't suffocate. When she stood, Frank didn't stop her. "Would you show me the house sometime?" she asked quietly, her eyes not quite meeting his. He blinked once. "Yeah, of course." She turned, pausing in the doorway. Frank, she said. He looked up. Thank you. And for the first time, she didn't mean it as a survival tactic. She meant it as herself. When she was gone, Frank sat at the table long after his tea had gone cold, staring at the place where she'd sat, at the way she'd said his name. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own home. The rain came late in the afternoon. It wasn't loud or heavy, more like a whisper spread across the roof, steady and cold. Frank stood beneath the overhang of the back deck, a mug of half-cooled tea in his hand, watching water slip from the edges of the stone gutters. The air smelled of wet moss and ash. He didn't hear her approach, but he felt her before he saw her. Sarai moved like she had no weight, no sound. She stepped into the open frame of the doorway behind him, arms crossed loosely, long hair falling down one side like ink. The light from the hallway spilled across her skin, highlighting the delicate blue tones beneath her collarbone. She hadn't spoken since that morning, not since she'd said his name, not since she'd thanked him. "You can come out," he said without turning. "It's dry under here." She hesitated, then stepped onto the deck. The rain reached toward her but stopped short, repelled by the shielding barrier that shimmered faintly overhead. He glanced sideways. She was barefoot. Her feet touched the cold stone without flinching. After a long silence, she said, "I remember rain like this." On Elian Alti, Frank's brow lifted. "That where you're from?" She nodded. "Before everything." The pause that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with weight, with the kind of energy that comes just before something cracks open. "I want to tell you something," she said, so quietly he barely heard. He looked at her more fully now. Her eyes were unreadable but not distant. She was present, real, and standing on the edge of something she hadn't dared voice for years. He didn't speak, just waited. Sarai stepped to the railing, rested her hands on the edge, and stared into the forest. "I was born in a city carved from living crystal," she began. "Our walls would hum when we slept, not because of machines, but because of us. My people, we were connected. We didn't speak the way humans do. We felt every joy, every ache, every dream. We carried it together." Frank said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt. "I had a brother," she continued, "Ilan. He used to sneak into the heart garden with me and pick leaves he wasn't supposed to touch. When we got caught, he always took the blame. He said the high voices would forgive him faster because I had a softer soul." Her voice trembled slightly. "One night, I was dreaming of a storm. Real, not metaphor. Thunder that shook your bones. I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. But it wasn't just one window. It was everything. Our whole city. Shattered. Burned." Frank's grip on the mug tightened. "They came without warning. Human ships, under Union banners, but with no insignia, no diplomats, no demands. Just fire. Our resonance, what we were born with, was labeled as a weapon, a threat. They said we were destabilizing systems, that we made other species feel too much." She turned to look at him. Her eyes weren't angry. They were tired. "They killed my parents in the first wave. I felt it before I saw it. My brother tried to shield me. He screamed for them to take him instead." Frank's voice came low. "They didn't." She shook her head. "They put a dampener collar on me. Said I was high yield. That's what they called it, like I was a tool, not a child. They tested my responses to grief, to hunger, to terror. They called it calibration." Frank exhaled, a breath that shook more than he meant it to. "I was sold 3 times before I turned 16, she said. "Each owner worse than the last. They didn't even pretend to treat me like a person, just a mirror. They fed off what I reflected. The more pain I felt, the more pleasure they took. And if I resisted," her voice broke. "If I tried to go still, they used devices to inject synthetic emotions, things I didn't want to feel. I could be forced into love, panic, ecstasy, like a puppet." She looked away. "The worst wasn't the pain," she whispered. "It was when I started to forget how to feel anything on my own. Everything I felt was someone else's. I didn't know where I ended, and they began." The rain kept falling. The air was heavy with it. Even the forest seemed to be listening. "I stopped using my name," she added, "because no one else did. I was just it, or the blue thing, or the empath. And when you're called something enough times, you begin to become it." Frank set the mug down slowly and moved to stand beside her. "I've seen a lot of horror," he said. "But I've never heard anything like that." She didn't reply. "I don't know how to make that better," he admitted. "I don't think I can. You already did something. Frank looked at her. You didn't ask me to be anything, she said. You didn't want me to make you feel better, or worse. You just let me be quiet. Do you know how rare that is? He nodded slowly. And when you said my name, she added, her voice barely above the rain, you said it like it was mine, not a warning, not a threat, just like it belonged to me. Frank swallowed hard. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it, for what they did, for what my kind did. She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his quiet shock, she reached out and gently touched his hand. I don't forgive you, she said. Not yet. That's fair. But I believe you mean it. He turned his hand over, fingers closing lightly around hers. Not tight, not possessive, just contact. Real, simple, human. The rain softened to a mist around them, and for the first time in years, Sirai didn't feel like a weapon, or a tool, or an echo of someone else's desires. She felt like herself, scarred, yes, but whole. And she realized maybe that was the real reason she was still alive. Not to serve, not to be punished, but to survive long enough to find a moment like this, where someone saw her and didn't flinch. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment the air was still, thick with the scent of wet earth and iron. The next, thunder cracked so loud the walls shuddered. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the house into silence and shadow. Frank cursed softly under his breath as he grabbed the old plasma lantern from the hallway shelf. It wasn't the first time the generator had failed, but it was the first time since she'd arrived. The estate was old, powered by a mix of decaying solar batteries and salvaged Union tech, never meant to withstand Velhara's erratic climate. Frank had been meaning to replace it for months. Now the storm had made that decision for him. He didn't think twice before heading toward the basement. Sirai heard him moving. She was in the library, curled up beside a cold window, her fingers resting on the spine of an untouched book. The sudden blackout didn't scare her. She had lived through far worse. But the house felt different now. Without the lights and hum of old circuits, the silence pressed in closer. The storm outside rattled the glass in angry pulses. She stood, moving toward the hallway, just in time to see the faint flicker of Frank's lantern vanishing down the basement steps. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she followed. The stairs groaned under her feet, but she moved quietly, her steps light and soundless. At the bottom, the air turned colder, damp. The smell of rust and old circuits filled her nose. She heard him before she saw him, grunting as he knelt beside a cracked generator casing, tools scattered across the floor, lantern propped on a crate nearby. Damn thing's fried, he muttered, then reached in with a wrench and twisted hard. That's when she saw the flash of silver across his side, the blade tip of an exposed panel he hadn't noticed. It sliced clean through the fabric and into his skin. He hissed in pain and staggered back. Frank, she called, stepping into the room. He looked up, startled. It's fine, just a cut. But it wasn't fine. She reached him in 2 steps, her hands already at his side, gently lifting the torn shirt to inspect the wound. It was deeper than he thought, gaping and raw, blood seeping fast. We need to stop the bleeding, she said, voice steady but tight. Without waiting for permission, she pulled at the edge of her tunic, tearing the fabric into a makeshift bandage. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped it around his waist, pressing it firmly against the wound. Frank hissed again but didn't stop her. You've done this before, he said between breaths. I've had to, she murmured. They were close now, too close. She could feel the heat of his skin under her fingers, the rise and fall of his breath. And for the first time she noticed the scars beneath the blood, raised lines and twisted shapes across his ribs and abdomen, symbols burned into flesh. She touched one without thinking. They're Thalen. Our markings. Frank didn't move. I got them after Tyrion's gate, he said quietly. When I realized what I'd been part of, I branded myself with every village name that burned. Thought maybe if I carried it, I wouldn't forget. Her throat tightened. You didn't have to do that. No, he said, but I needed to. She pressed her palm flat against the worst of the scars, not with pressure, but with something softer, connection. His breath hitched. I tried to save one girl, he said, during the evacuation. She was maybe 10, small, quiet. She didn't even cry. I carried her through the tunnels, thought we'd make it. But the blast, it took the whole exit. I was the only one still moving. Sirai didn't say anything. She couldn't. She looked at him now, not the soldier, not the man who had bought her freedom. but the bleeding, broken body in front of her, wrapped in pain he didn't show anyone else. And in that moment, she felt something strange. Not pity, not duty, just the overwhelming urge to touch his face. So she did. Her fingers brushed along his jaw, across the day-old stubble, up to the faint scar just below his temple. He closed his eyes, and then without ceremony or hesitation, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a dramatic kiss, not fueled by passion, not weighted with promise. It was quiet, careful. She kissed him because he hadn't asked for it, because he hadn't expected it, because he was sitting there, bleeding and ashamed, and hadn't once looked at her like she owed him anything. And for the first time, she had something that was entirely hers to give. When she pulled back, he looked at her like she'd spoken a language he almost understood but hadn't heard in years. "Sirai," he whispered, her name like a secret. She stood, wiping her hands on the edge of her torn tunic. "You need to rest," she said. "You're losing too much blood." He tried to speak, but she cut him off with a look. "I'll finish the generator." His eyes widened. "You know how to—" She gave the faintest hint of a smile. "They made sure I could fix whatever they broke." He leaned back against the wall and let her take over. She worked in silence, sleeves rolled up, fingers steady. Her movements were practiced, mechanical, precise. Every switch she flipped, every wire she adjusted, brought light back into the estate piece by piece. But even after the power returned, she didn't leave. She sat beside him, back to the wall, not touching but close. The storm passed in slow waves above them. The wind faded. The thunder softened. Rain whispered through the pipes but no longer screamed against the glass. Frank's breathing slowed. Sirai leaned her head back against the wall. She didn't reach for his hand, and he didn't ask for it. But when they rose together to climb back upstairs, they didn't walk side by side like strangers anymore. They didn't sleep together that night, but they didn't sleep apart again, not because of lust, because in the dark, in that broken room when everything was still, they had seen something in each other neither had expected. The truth of who they were, not victims, not monsters, just two people trying not to disappear. The morning light broke pale and silver through the trees. Velara's mist clung low to the forest floor, winding around the roots and stones like a living thing. Inside the estate, the stillness was almost peaceful. If you didn't know what to listen for, Frank did. He heard it in the slight whine of the sensor array, the flicker in the external shield diagnostics, the small inconsistencies that only meant one thing. They had company. He didn't say anything at first. Not until he saw the ship breaking through the atmosphere, fast, low, and unregistered. Not military, not Union. Something worse, privately owned, stripped of identifiers, flying like it had nothing to lose. Sirai was already awake. She stood in the main hallway with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, like she'd been waiting for the sky to split open. He approached her quietly. "We're not alone," he said. "I know," she replied. They walked together to the comm room. The ship had landed just outside the cloaking field, 2 clicks from the edge of the estate. Frank's systems couldn't pull up a name, but the energy signature told him more than enough. The knock on the front door came 20 minutes later, sharp, unhurried. Frank tapped the intercom. "Name," he said flatly. A man's voice came through, smooth and emotionless. "Cale Merrick, private retrieval and asset enforcement. I'm here for the empath." Sirai flinched so subtly most wouldn't notice. Frank did. "She's not yours," Frank said. "She was never yours either," Cale replied. "You think this is about possession? This is about security. She's a classified witness. You're harboring stolen property tied to criminal operations across 4 sectors. She's not property," Frank said, and cut the connection. They locked the doors, sealed the estate. Frank turned to her, jaw clenched. "Why are they really here, Sirai?" She didn't answer at first. He moved closer, softened his voice. "Why do they want you back?" Her throat worked silently before she spoke. "Because I watched them." Frank's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" Sirai took a slow breath, as if bracing to say something she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "They used me in places where secrets were currency," she said. "Private estates, black sites, royal gatherings, high-ranking military bases no one was supposed to know existed. I wasn't there to perform, Frank. I was there to feel." Her voice dropped into something flat, bitter. They needed someone who could absorb their shame, their guilt, their twisted joys, someone who didn't speak, who never questioned. I wasn't just a mirror to them. I was a confessional. She looked him in the eyes. I saw everything, and they know it. Frank stood still, the weight of her words sinking in. They're not coming to reclaim me because I'm valuable, she continued. They're coming to erase me, because if I'm free, I can talk. Frank's voice was low, steady. Then they'll have to go through me first. A sad smile touched her lips. That's the problem. They're used to doing exactly that. At nightfall, the attack began, a ripple through the outer shield, the soft whine of cutting drones pressing against the estate's perimeter. Frank activated countermeasures, rerouted power from non-essential systems, and opened the weapons vault buried in the floor of the armory. Sirai stood behind him. She didn't hesitate. You trained with these? He asked. I've trained to survive. She picked up a plasma sidearm like it belonged to her. Kale breached the estate during the second wave. 2 drones dropped from the canopy. Sirai ducked, pivoted, and shot one clean through the sensor core. Frank handled the second. They moved in tandem, silent, efficient. When Kale finally stepped inside, he was alone. He stood in the main corridor, weapon lowered. He didn't look like a slaver. He looked like a man who believed the world owed him obedience. I'm not here to hurt her, he said. Frank didn't answer. Kale's eyes shifted to Sirai. You're not safe here. You think this is freedom? This is temporary. You think he can protect you when the clients start asking questions? Sirai stepped forward. No one's asking questions, she said. They're giving orders, the kind that end in silence. You're not a threat, he said coldly. You're a liability. And that's why I'm dangerous now, isn't it? She said. Because I remember who you are under your uniform. Because I watched you cry when you thought no one could feel it. Because I saw what you did in that back room on Daenerys Prime. His jaw twitched. You don't get to walk away, Kale growled. I already did. He raised his weapon. She didn't flinch. Frank fired before Kale could finish aiming. One clean shot into his shoulder. The gun clattered to the floor. Kale dropped to his knees, teeth clenched against the pain. Frank walked toward him slowly. You should have stayed hidden, Kale hissed. So should you, Frank replied. They left him alive, but barely. Long enough to crawl back to whoever had paid him. Long enough to send a message. Afterward, the house was quiet again. Frank leaned against the kitchen counter, blood drying on his sleeves, staring at the floor like he could still hear the sound of the gunshot. Sirai stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, not shivering, but close. He looked up. I'm sorry, he said. For what? That you had to see him again. That you had to feel all of that again. She stepped closer. I'm not sorry, she said. He reminded me why I can never go back, and why I don't want to run anymore. Frank met her gaze. I won't let them take you. She shook her head. It's not about them taking me. Then what is it? It's about me choosing to stay. That night, they didn't sleep in separate rooms. They didn't talk much. But when Frank turned off the lights and she slid beneath the covers beside him, it wasn't about comfort. It was about something simpler, something deeper, trust. And for the first time, Sarai didn't feel like someone else's witness. She felt seen. The quiet after a storm wasn't really silence. Not here. It was the sound of leaves dripping under morning light, of soil soaked with rain, of small branches creaking softly in the wind. It was the slow breath of a forest finally at ease. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Sirai didn't wake with dread in her chest. The air in the estate felt lighter. She sat up in bed, his bed now, though neither of them had called it that out loud, and pressed her feet to the cold floor, grounding herself in the present. The room still smelled faintly of metal, of old tech and tea, and now, of him. That strange, steady scent of earth and gun oil, and something she had no name for. Frank wasn't beside her. She didn't panic. Instead, she stretched slowly, her joints stiff but not aching, and walked barefoot to the window. Below in the courtyard, Frank was splitting old wooden planks with an axe. The motion was fluid, rhythmic, controlled. Not like a soldier, not anymore. Like a man who had finally found something useful to do with his hands. He paused between swings, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. She watched him for a long time. The muscles in his shoulders moved with quiet force, not the kind that wanted to be seen, the kind that came from years of carrying weight no one else could hold, and he wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to escape something. He was just here, alive. She stepped back from the glass before he could see her watching. Later, she found him in the kitchen. He'd changed into a clean shirt, sleeves rolled up. He stood barefoot at the stove, flipping something in a pan with a little more focus than necessary. There were 2 mugs already filled on the table. She walked in silently and sat without a word. He glanced over his shoulder and smirked faintly. "I made eggs." She tilted her head. "You eat eggs?" "Sometimes." He set a plate in front of her. "Not synthetic, real protein. Raised them myself." Her eyebrows lifted. "You raise animals?" "Chickens. 3 of them. They hate me, but they lay." She smiled. He slid into the seat across from her. They ate in silence for a moment. It was easy, too easy. She didn't know how to name this feeling. It wasn't safety exactly. It was quieter than that. It was ease, the absence of threat. The simplicity of 2 people sharing food without needing to apologize for being alive. After a while, he said, "You sleep okay?" She nodded. "I didn't dream." "That's good." "I think it's because I didn't go to bed alone." Frank blinked, then looked down at his plate, like the table had suddenly become fascinating. Soraya didn't tease him. Instead, she said, "I don't know what this is." He looked up. "But I don't want it to stop." He didn't respond with words. He just reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. Her breath caught. It wasn't a possessive touch, not an apology, not a thank you, just presence. Warm, steady, real. That afternoon, they walked the perimeter of the estate together, not for safety, just to see it. The sky had cleared into pale blue. Mist clung low to the ground, but the sun cut through in golden slants. Everything smelled like renewal. Damp wood, moss, distant pollen. Soraya stopped near the old greenhouse. "I want to grow something," she said. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Something that doesn't exist here. Something Thalen, if I can." He nodded. "We've got enough salvage to build a hydro chamber. I'll help you set it up." She smiled, and something in his chest pulled tight. It was the way she said "I want," not "I'll try," not "I could." It was a declaration. Small, yes, but more powerful than any weapon he'd ever held. She wanted to build. She was ready to stay. That night, the temperature dropped. A thin chill crept through the walls. They lit the old fireplace in the study for the first time. Frank hadn't used it in years, not since the last time he tried to feel warm and failed. But this time was different. Sirai sat on the rug, a heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders, legs crossed, eyes half-lidded in the firelight. Her hair glowed like obsidian, catching hints of gold. Frank leaned back against the couch behind her, a book open but forgotten in his lap. She spoke without looking at him. "Do you know what the worst part was?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Not the pain, not even the loneliness. She turned her face slightly toward the fire. "It was that they never called me by my name. Not once, for years. I was a number, a trait, a classification. Empath class specimen 04B. That was who I was." Frank swallowed hard. "I didn't even say it out loud for a long time. I was afraid I'd forget how it sounded." He leaned forward slowly. "Sirai." She turned to face him. "I want to be someone new," she said. "You already are." Her lips parted. Not quite a smile. Not quite grief. Something in between. "Then say it again." "Sirai." She reached for his hand. Again. He did. And she kissed him. Not like before, not with hesitation, not with caution. This time it was deeper, slower. It tasted like fire and frost, like survival and surrender. Her fingers curled into the front of his shirt. His hand slid to her waist. They didn't speak. Words had lost their power. Only touch remained. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I'm still afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he said. She smiled. "That makes me feel better." They sat like that for a long time, breathing, existing, together. Later, as they lay under the worn blankets in the quiet dark, Frank traced slow circles on her back. Not to seduce, not to soothe, just to remind himself she was real. She looked at him through the dim starlight. "What happens now?" He sighed. "I don't know." "Good." He blinked. She nestled closer. "I don't want to know. Not everything. I like that we don't have a map." He let out a small laugh. "You sure you're not human? Not even close?" He kissed her temple. "Doesn't matter." Sirai fell asleep before he did. He lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange warmth in his chest grow heavier, not painful, just unfamiliar. He had carried so much guilt for so long it had replaced the parts of him that once felt human. But now there was room for something else. He turned on his side, tucked her closer, and finally slept without dreams. The signal came at dawn. No alarms, no explosions. Just a clean, deliberate ping across the comm grid, cutting through layers of noise like a whisper pressed to the skin. It was a signature not from a bounty network or pirate channel, but from the Union itself. Frank stood at the console, jaw locked, staring at the soft, blinking icon that now pulsed like a heartbeat. "They're here," he said. Sarai was in the doorway. She didn't flinch. "How many?" "3 ships, ident-coded, official." He paused. "No weapons powered. They're coming for us." He looked over his shoulder. "Or for what we know." Sarai stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. "Then let's tell them, all of it, but on my terms." Frank nodded. "Always." They didn't pack. They didn't hide. Instead, they opened the house, windows drawn wide, doors unbarred. The air moved freely through the rooms, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment of truth. Sarai lit candles along the walkways, not for protection, but for presence. "If they're going to see me," she said, "then they'll see me, not what they tried to shape." Frank activated the emergency relay, one he'd rigged years ago but never used. It opened a secure channel to a Union whistleblower hub buried in dead satellite architecture. Into it, he fed everything. Witness located, empath class, memory intact, Union classified abuses confirmed, she will speak, and if anything happens to her, the truth goes wide. He paused, then signed it. Commander Elias Franklin Wren. The Union ships landed just past the tree line like ghosts made of steel. 3 in total, no weapons drawn, no sirens, just quiet, calculating descent. A single figure stepped out from the lead ship, no armor, no guards, a message in itself. Frank met him at the front steps, unarmed but unyielding. Sarai stood beside him in a loose black tunic, her silver-violet eyes catching the early light like a promise. The man approached slowly and stopped a respectful distance away. "Marshal Darren," he said, voice calm. "Reconciliation branch. I'm not here to detain. I'm here to negotiate." Frank folded his arms. "You're 2 decades too late." "I know." Sarai's voice cut clean through the air. "Then speak." Marshal Darren nodded once. He tapped a device strapped to his wrist. A holographic screen flickered between them, displaying Union seals, legal forms, and a series of official statements. This document recognizes Sarai Thalen as a sovereign being under Union Statute 493A, autonomous sentient with protection against prosecution, transfer, surveillance, or reclassification. You are free, permanently, legally. He looked at her. "No one owns you. No one ever will again." Sarai stared at the hologram but didn't reach for it. "I don't want freedom granted by law. I want freedom by truth. I want to speak." Marshal Darren nodded. "We want you to. But not in secret, not behind Union walls. No resonance harness, no filtered recordings. I say what I lived, and you listen. Raw, unedited, agreed." "And he stays," she added, glancing at Frank. "He's part of this. Without him, there's no story to tell." Darren looked between them. "All charges against Elias Wren will be dropped. Full immunity under Article 7. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're going to make me a hero now?" Darren gave a faint, tired smile. But we're going to stop pretending you were the villain." The tribunal node was set up just beyond the estate perimeter, neutral ground. A mobile dome built in less than 24 hours, equipped with secure recording systems and limited Union presence. No guards, no suppressors, no tricks. Sarai entered it alone. She sat in a chair under a ring of soft lights, surrounded by silent observers, officials, historians, survivors. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She told them everything. About Kale, about the numbered rooms, about the faces behind masks, the way pain was turned into art, the way her silence was auctioned, and her emotions shaped like weapons. She gave names, coordinates, logs burned into memory not because she wanted to keep them, but because she wasn't allowed to forget. Frank watched from the other side of the glass. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't need to. She was stronger than all of them now, and when it was over, no one dared question her truth. Afterward, they were offered relocation, new names, clean records, a chance to disappear again. Sarai declined. So did Frank. "We have roots now," she told them. "You don't pull those up just because the storm moved on." So they stayed, and for the first time in their lives, they built something. They transformed the old greenhouse into a sanctuary. Violet blooms from her homeworld, grown from memory and instinct, filled the air with soft perfume. Frank reinforced the old tower, turned it into a library, filled with handwritten notes, journals, and records from soldiers and slaves alike. People came, quietly at first, survivors, seekers, broken pieces of other stories. They weren't offered salvation. They were offered a seat at the table, a meal, a place to breathe. Sarai sang again, in her native tongue, then in human dialects. Not for performance, not for pay. Just because she could. Frank wrote. Letters he never sent. To commanders. To enemies. To the boy he used to be. To the woman beside him. Sometimes they made love in the soft light of early morning, slow and careful, like the world might shatter around them. Sometimes they just held hands in the dark and said nothing at all. Because sometimes survival didn't mean screaming. It meant choosing. It meant staying. One evening, as the mist crept low over the earth and the stars peeked out between violet clouds, Sarai knelt by the garden bed, planting the last of her Thielen seedlings. Frank brought her a mug of warm cider. She looked up, cheeks streaked with soil, eyes glowing. I never thought I'd want tomorrow, she said softly. Frank crouched beside her. And now? She smiled, brushing her fingers against his. Now, I don't want to miss it. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. You won't. They sat in silence as the wind stirred the leaves. Two souls once engineered for war and silence, now holding something neither had believed in anymore. The morning was warm in a way that felt earned. Not artificial heat, not survival heat, but sunlight, real, golden, soft as breath, slipping through the long windows and kissing the bedsheets where two bodies lay tangled in peace. Sarai stirred first, but she didn't move. Frank's arm was draped over her waist, his face buried in her neck, his breathing even and deep. She could feel the slow rise and fall of his chest, the rough edge of his unshaven jaw against her shoulder, the weight of a man who no longer had to sleep with one eye open. It still surprised her sometimes, that he trusted sleep again, that she did too. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence, not the kind that used to scream with fear, but the kind that hummed with peace. No communications, no alarms, no footsteps outside the door, just the birds, and the man beside her. When he finally shifted awake, it was slow. A breath against her skin, a faint groan, then his voice, hoarse, quiet, and close. You're still here, she smiled without opening her eyes. So are you. He kissed the back of her shoulder. You slept in, he murmured. You held me down, she said, arching back into him. Not fair. He chuckled softly, lips brushing her spine. I didn't want to wake up without you. Now she rolled to face him, their legs tangling naturally, like they had never belonged anywhere else. His eyes were still heavy with sleep, but they softened the moment they found hers. What are you thinking, he asked. Sarai traced a finger down the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a remnant from long before her, a wound he never talked about. That I never imagined I'd get to wake up in peace with you. Frank exhaled slowly, pressing his forehead against hers. I used to think I was built for war, he said. That peace wasn't something I deserved. You do, she whispered. We both do. He kissed her then, not like before. This kiss didn't carry urgency or desperation. It wasn't a promise or a plea, it was a moment, one full of quiet love, soft lips against soft lips, slow and unguarded. Her fingers curled into his shirt. His hands slid into her hair. They didn't rush it. There was no reason to. When they pulled apart, their foreheads still touched. I love you, Frank said, just above a whisper. Sarai blinked. She'd felt it in every gesture, every silence, every moment he'd stood between her and the world. But hearing it, spoken aloud, real and unafraid, brought tears to her eyes. She leaned into him again. I love you too. They stayed there a while longer, curled up in the center of a bed that didn't feel like a shelter anymore, but a home. Later, they walked barefoot through the garden. Sarai had planted new Thielen blossoms the week before, soft, star-shaped flowers with glowing centers. They pulsed faintly in the daylight, their scent sweet and nostalgic. Frank crouched to touch one gently. You made this grow. Sarai nodded. They only bloom if they sense harmony. He stood, brushing dirt from his palms. Then that's proof right there. You're magic. She laughed, the sound light and melodic. It's not magic. It's intention, patience, and love. He looked at her then, sunlight catching in her dark hair, her bare arms dusted with pollen, her violet eyes brighter than ever. I don't think I'll ever stop falling for you. You don't have to, she said. Just don't ever stop telling me when you do. He stepped forward, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her again, this time under the open sky. She melted into it, heart swelling, breath catching, body remembering what it meant to feel safe. Not just safe, wanted, chosen, and free. The rest of the day unfolded like a dream they never dared write down. They cooked together, laughing when she burned the bread, teasing him when he oversalted the stew. They danced barefoot on the stone floor when a forgotten song played from the old receiver, her head against his chest, his hand firm on her back. They shared stories. Of before, of now, of what they could be. And as the stars emerged one by one, as the day faded into dusk, Frank brought out something he'd been hiding for weeks. A handmade necklace, a single Thelin crystal, faintly glowing, set in a woven band of salvaged leather. He held it out to her with no speech, no pressure, just an offering. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She took it with both hands, eyes shimmering. I want to stay, she whispered, forever. Then stay, he said, and I'll build a forever around you. That night they lay under the stars. No sheets, no walls, just blankets and each other on the rooftop. The mist stayed low. The trees were quiet. And for the first time in a long, long time, there was no war left to fight, only love and the freedom to live it together.